Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, January 20th, 2026, and our dear friend John Helmer is here with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you very much for having me, and welcome back to you, Nima.
John, let me start with what's going on between Russia and the United States and the talks, these endless talks between Kirill Dmitriev and Steve Witkoff. What is new in this new round of negotiations between the United States and Russia? And do you see any sort of hope that they can achieve something this time around?
Nothing's new in the talks between Kirill Dmitriev and the US side. And let's just put this into the bigger context. The context is Davos, but that's a symbol of the war between the capital resources of the two sides in this international global war. There's a war of capital, and I'll come back to that in a minute because President Putin was very clear as long ago as 2001 when he met with George W. Bush in describing the situation as a war between Jewish capital and Islamic capital. Let me come back to that in a minute. In There is a war between the capital of Russia and the rest of world, or in particular the United States and Europe. And in that war, Kirill Dmitriev represents the Russian Development Investment Fund, Direct Investment Fund, which is a pygmy. It's a pygmy representing $10 billion versus the real capital stores of Norway, which is 1.8 trillion. We're talking about the sovereign wealth funds. In that world of capital, represented symbolically at Davos, Dmitriev's a pygmy. China, Norway, I'm looking at my chart here, United Emirates, Kuwait, they're at the $1 trillion level. Dmitriev represents $10 billion. $10 billion. But the real capital of Russia remains exactly the way it was when President Putin came to power. That's the oligarchs. And the oligarchs control a capital that's essentially remained offshore. And as President Putin called it in 2001, Jewish capital. That's part one. Part two is we have a sea war, a war to control the trade of the world, of which Greenland is an important but still small part. It's a key to who controls the Arctic trade route. While the British control the Straits of Gibraltar entering the Mediterranean, the US plans to control Suez, the Hormuz Strait, the Red Sea, in alliance with Israel. The US aims to control Panama, as we already know, and the Straits of Malacca between the Pacific and Indian Ocean. We can go on, and we can come back to the sea war because in that war, Britain, Italy, uh, the Baltic states are all aligned with the United States to attack Russian tankers. And we'll come back to what Russia's doing in a minute. These are the two fundamental lines of war, in addition to the land war in the Ukraine. Now, in what way does Mr. Dmitriev, representing pygmy capital, but in effect oligarch interests in Russia, what way does he represent the capability to negotiate terms for the land war, which is being fought by the General Staff, the intelligence services, with a backup from the Foreign Ministry? Does he? Can he? No, the answer is no. On the other side, there is Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner and others who represent U.S. capital and world capital. And are they talking terms for ending the land war? Of course they're not. They're trying to find a method for controlling Russian capital to the ends that President Trump and the Europeans, I continue to emphasize, as we've done before, the exaggeration of the notion of a split between Europe and the United States on these fundamental issues. Europe and the United States are combined to attack Russia on the land in the Ukrainian battlefield and in all the other theaters moving north to the Arctic. So, what is the pretension? And it's a pretension of the pygmy to negotiate terms for ending the land war. That's a pretension. It's not going to succeed in solving any of the fundamental problems because Dmitriev represents a force inside Russia which is already wants to resume business as usual and become dependent in this war, not independent.
Yeah. John, do you feel that the case you mentioned that Europe and the United States are all in Ukraine? They are, somehow they're pursuing the same sort of policy. But when it comes to Greenland and the differences is, somehow you cannot ignore the differences between the United States
Hmm.
and and Europeans when it comes to Greenland. How much of a threat is that for the future of NATO?
Well, let's start with the basics here. Uh, uh, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, has just done his sort of annual roundup uh, of the diplomatic situation and the diplomatic record of Russia, and has tried to say that Russia is not threatened and does not threaten Greenland, a ditto the Chinese. That's not the perception of the United States and Europe combined. Greenland is the key to control long term of the Arctic transportation route, or the northern route as it's known in Russia. Until and unless the foreign ministry, the Kremlin, uh, openly expresses what's obvious, this is an attack on a new battlefield threatening Russia. And for Mr. Lavrov to say we're going to step back and watch without attempting to threaten or participate in the argument between the Europeans, Denmark, and the United States is simply to say the Russia is crossing its fingers that the division of opinion currently expressed on Greenland between the Europeans and the United States will benefit Russia in the long term. That's wishful thinking, entirely wishful thinking. The publicity that you're mentioning is entirely exaggerated. Yes, the Greenlanders themselves want independence of both Denmark, the European Union, and the United States. They want, obviously, and they say so with eloquence and clarity. They want to be able to determine their future for themselves. But in what world do they think they're functioning? Obviously, they understand that the United States certainly will use Greenland as a military base to extend its power into the Arctic to threaten Russia. It's the other way round. Until Russia says that's what's happening, it's delusional. Okay. Second, can Russia extract any benefit out of the fight in the press between the Europeans, the Danes, and the United States on this issue? No, it cannot, and neither can the Chinese. The Russians and Chinese are as weak rhetorically in this argument as they were on Venezuela or as they are on Gaza. We can go back to each of these, and we should. We should. The fact of the matter is that Greenland is part of the war against Russia at sea. And I see just today in Moscow the reflection of the view that Russia must mobilize its Navy and Air Force now to protect the Russian flagged tanker fleet, to protect Russia's tankers. This is spelled out for the first time in Vzglyad this morning. This is an attempt to mobilize uh, Russian capital, Russian public opinion, Russian um, media behind the line that Russia must act proactively in the Arctic, in the Mediterranean, in the Channel, and so forth. Well, so where does Greenland fit into this? The answer is if Russia doesn't act proactively, it will be acted on. This is the new theater after the end of the Ukraine war. But the Ukraine war isn't ending soon. And we can come back to that too. Why is the Ukraine war not ending under the escalating pressure on the ground of the electric war campaign that's knocking the power out in the west of the Ukraine, in the decision making centers of the Ukraine? Why is the US, why are the Europeans failing to come to precise terms for pausing or ending the Ukraine war on terms that provide long term security? The roots of the crisis is the phrase in the Russian side. Why? I should have thought this is simple and obvious, but we got to say it again. You're in Iran, you understand and have accepted and publicly say Iran is under permanent threat of both internal regime change and external attack by the allies, all of them, right? The same isn't admitted by Russia. The same is not admitted by Russia. Greenland is part of a small part. That's not to belittle the Greenlanders. It's it's simply to say it's absurd to not to believe that Denmark, which is one of the most hostile anti-Russian forces in Europe, should derive any form of support from Russia or any belief that Denmark will divide and oppose the United States in the long term war against Russia. If that's their long term strategy, if that's their long term strategy, there can be no real genuine split, neither on Greenland nor on Ukraine for the future. And this Greenland crisis can't be solved on any terms that benefit Russia, either on the Ukraine battlefield or on the war at sea, or in the war between the two forms of capital. And on this point, and the reason I began with the reference to President Putin back in 2001, is I've just produced an analysis of exactly what President Putin has been saying 25 years ago with George W. Bush and what he's saying now with President Trump. And I invite our audience to go to Dances with Bears and read exactly what President Putin said then and compare it to what he's saying now. So the short answer to your question, Nima, is no, no, no. Greenland is an exaggeration which will be solved on terms that are anti Russian, which will continue the war against Russia at sea, on land, in the air, and in the capital markets of the world. And in that war, Kirill Dmitriev, the pygmy, the $10 billion sovereign wealth fund versus the $1 trillion wealth funds, has no significant contribution except surrender.
Yeah. John, are we closer to? I don't know what's going on in the mind of the people, or the most particularly in the mind of the decision makers in Russia. How do they see all these sort of talks, endless talks, and how do you evaluate the behavior of the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov? And is he participating somehow in these negotiations? Is he behind the scene receiving all these messages? Or Kirill Dmitriev has his own team, and he's doing all the job, and maybe later on the outcome is going to be reported to Lavrov. How do you evaluate, how do you assess the relationship between Kirill Dmitriev and Lavrov?
We've tried to say this, describe this since the beginning of last year. Nima, and you'll recall it. There was open hostility between the foreign minister and Dmitriev at the first meeting in Riyadh between the Russian side and the US side. This hostility reflects an underlying view that Kirill Dmitriev does not negotiate for Russia's underlying strategic interests. He negotiates for Russia's oligarch business interests, which have comprised, and we won't see Foreign Minister Lavrov saying this, but it's well expressed in the State Duma and in the press. This capital that Dmitriev represents is a fifth column inside Russia that's pro American, that wants a deal on any terms to stop the war, to reduce the sanctions, to allow Russian capital to continue to flow out of the country. The absolute reverse of what a sovereign wealth fund is supposed to be doing. Okay, so there are factional differences of strategic importance inside the Russian decision making, let's say, structure around President Putin in the Security Council. And Dmitriev in the Security Council is in a small minority. He's not a minority in President Putin's policy making. If we look, for example, then at the contradictions that this faction fight generates, you can see it, for example, on a number of points. For example, the war at sea. When the last tanker boarding was attempted and successfully by President Trump, who celebrated the running away of the Russian Navy in that incident. The foreign ministry position was, this is international piracy. We oppose it. We strongly warn the US away from it. Nothing significant was done on a military level to deter the US, so Trump acted unilaterally, yes. Then Lavrov's spokesman, Maria Zakharova, thanked the United States for agreeing to release the two Russian nationals on board the vessel. She thanked the pirates. That's a plain contradiction with the policy line. The problem is that since Zakharova's thank you to the pirates, the two Russians haven't been released. Neither have a much larger number of Indian crew members on that tanker. In fact, the tanker interceptions, both in all seas, including German interception of a Russian tanker, an Italian seizure of a Russian cargo vessel. This is escalating. So, thanks to pirates is a line that Zakharova tried several days ago. It's failed. So today we find that the foreign ministry is attempting to toughen its line, but that's until and unless there's a Russian military component to deterring tanker and Russian vessel, Russian flag vessel interceptions. Until there's a Russian military response by air and by sea, nothing that's said by the foreign ministry is effective. It's empty talk. And you can't, if you're a foreign minister, be accepted as credible if you speak without applying the power to enforce what you say. So when Russia and the foreign ministry speak of the violation of international norms, but do nothing to enforce the international norms at sea or anywhere else, what are they saying? They're saying, hello, we are a paper tiger. Now, that's not the Russian military position in the Ukraine. But then the problem is Russian strategy one war at a time, we must solve the Ukraine battlefield on our terms, and then we can negotiate better strategic terms at sea, better relation with the United States on sanctions and so forth and so on. On these points, the Russian foreign ministry can be articulate by words, but impotent in terms of power. And then the rest of the world, including Russia's allies, the BRICS allies, whether they are India, China, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, or Cuba now have to ask, are Russia's assurances on paper and in public in words to be backed by military power, the support required to deter or block a combination of the Europeans and the Americans? That question's being asked from Cuba to Venezuela to Greenland, all over, and where you are in Iran. So I hope I've answered your question. We have no basis at the moment for understanding whether the factional differences in Moscow are how they will be resolved, either on the terms that would be, let's say, sufficient to end the war in the Ukraine, or on the terms that would be sufficient to end any of the other fronts in this war against Russia. We're nowhere near that now. What we have is exaggeration. And we see the same level of exaggeration, indecision, vacillation, and factional conflict on this question. Is Russia to accept President Trump's invitation for Mr. Putin to sit on the BOP, the Board of Peace, to supervise the genocide and transfer of Palestinian territory in Gaza to the control of U.S. capital, Israeli capital, and with their allies from Canada to Europe? On the one hand, you see Mr. Peskov announcing that President Putin is complimented, delighted to be invited to sit on the board. Second, we have some lack of clarity on the Russian side, starting with the foreign ministry, on whether this is a board of stooges designed to implement and rubber stamp decisions reached elsewhere. That's primarily by the Israeli military and the United States military in Gaza. What you see in the response to the invitation in Moscow, the same as in Minsk, Belarus, because Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, has also been invited. In fact, 50 countries have been invited. So who announces they've been invited? Well, the countries that want to make it appear that Trump respects them so much that they should sit on the board. Is it a mark of respect, as Lukashenko says, as Peskov has implied? Is it a mark of Trump's respect for Putin to be invited, or is it a mark of disrespect, a mark of an invitation to play puppet to Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu's string pulling? The Russian side can't get clear and unified its view on something like the seat at the BOP table. It can't get clear its response to the takeover of Russian tankers. Therefore, it can't get clear how it should handle the takeover of Greenland, the threat to take over a Russian ally, Cuba. It can't get clear. Instead, we have this rhetoric of international rules and norms, which the US is clearly intending and has always intended. Trump is simply the latest version, the clearest version of how the US intends to expand its hegemony. Against that, to suggest that Russia leads a group, China, India, and others, for multipolarity it's so many words. It's not effective on the ground or in the markets, the capital markets.
John, what is the assessment of the Russian government on what's going on? You've mentioned the case of Iran and the continuous threat coming from the United States, from Israel, and from those Iranian in diaspora. They're using these, for example, the son of the former Shah of Iran as a tool to manipulate the society here in Iran. It's all coordinated. When you look at the media, look at, for example, X, Starlink is a huge, network, all connected, you know, to Tel Aviv, all connected to Israel. And what is the assessment on the part of the Russians?
Well, do you mind if I put this question back to you first? You tell me, you're sitting in Iran. You've sat through this attempt, now a failed attempt at regime change inside the country. Tell me, or tell our audience, how Iran explains this explains this to Moscow for future cooperation in deterring future attacks, both internal to Iran. Tell me what you see as the Russian message to Russia, and then I'll tell you what I see as the Russian reply. How do you see your message to Russia, to Moscow?
I think what's going on right now in Iran, in terms of the military, in terms of the security, it seems that, no, not it seems, it definitely shows the government, the security forces, they have shown that they can control the whole situation here because they have cut off the connection between those people, those who are cooperating with the outside forces, masters, and they controlled so far. It was 2 days of protest, peaceful, somehow peaceful protests, then 2 or 3 days of riots, and they were just burning, killing people, and all of this, you know. And then you see the government coming out and just cutting off the internet connection,
Hmm.
and everything's just disappearing from the scene. All those riots, all those connections.
Yes.
And the I think what Iran sees in terms of what's going on in the West Asia, Iran seeks a very deep strategic partnership after this sort of thing. It's not just about the recent riots, the protests, then riots. It's about the war on Iran, Israeli war on Iran. It's all connected, John, because they feel what is happening here. You see the confidence. I see the confidence in this, the government that they can control everything here. They're somehow uh, capturing these people who are cooperating. Mostly, they came in from outside somehow because the border, Iran has a long border. They are connected with various ethnicities all along the borders, but they have controlled all the things. But they want, I what I see from Iran, the message to Russia would be, how can we go deeper to avoid these sort of manipulations? Because it's not just about Iran, it's about Russia as well. The whole game, the whole problem in Ukraine is because they want to balkanize Russia. The main goal is balkanizing Russia. The
Mm.
main goal is in Iran is to balkanize Iran. It's
Yeah.
not anything else. And I think these two countries, they have to understand that these deep problems after all. And the message, as I see, as I talk with Iranian officials, they really feel that way. They may didn't feel, I don't know, this way before, maybe 2 years ago, but as time goes by, they feel the threat, the continuous threat coming from the United States and Israel.
Hmm.
And this is the message, in my opinion, from the Iranian officials, from the Iranian people to Russia, deepening the relationship and improving the security agreement between the two nations.
On that score, does do your Iranian sources, does your reading of what they say imply that they trust President Putin personally
Yeah,
or not.
they trust President Putin. They trust his administration. They feel that he's honest in the way that he's behaving. And because the core issue for Iran, John, we can bring Israel in, but Israel has some tools within the region. Those tools are the same enemy of Russia and Iran. They're not different. Russia has the same enemies. Iran has the same enemies, and the two as I talk with them, they feel that the 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 Putin administration and the Pezeshkian administration, they both recognize and understand the threat and the depth of the threat that they're facing. And I don't see the difference between the two governments, but of course they have to talk. They have to, find a solution for this sort of, because Russia is not happy about what's going on. You see what Russia said at the Security Council, and they've shown what is the position of Russia. But how do they feel it when you evaluate, when you assess the situation in Russia? Do they talk about it? Do they see as a threat, as an immediate threat to whole the security, architecture of the region?
Well, we've discussed this many times before, Nima, and thank you for making it so clear. In this latest piece of mine, I read that President Putin told George Bush back in 2000 April 2002 that he implied his support for the Israeli attack on Jenin at the time, the massacre and destruction of the West Bank Palestinians back then, and he was shocked and hostile when the Iranian President Khatami expressed support for the Palestinians. That was April 2002. And he assured the President of the United States at the time that Russia, he personally, and Russia institutionally, supported the US against Iran, support for the Palestinians. Now that's 2002, 24 years ago. Then we have to say, is the private Putin line the same as the public Putin line? Is President Putin's line opposed by the general staff, the intelligence services, the foreign ministry, and so forth? And how are there differences? Differences on support of Israel, differences on accepting Israel's security as a higher priority than Iranian security. How are all these issues resolved internally in Moscow at the moment? And I have to say, I'm not sure. I'm not convinced by the public display that President Putin understands, accepts that Israel is the threat as a spearhead for the United States to attack both Iran and India and Russia and China and so forth. Is that President Putin's private conviction? What we know now about his private conviction 25 years ago with George Bush was his private conviction wasn't what he was saying in public. There's a disjunction between the two. Has Russia learned its lessons since 2002 from the series of wars against Iran, the series of wars in the Middle East and everywhere else surrounding Russia? Has Russia learned its lessons, and has President Putin changed his mind? I'm sure it's very reassuring. And it is reassuring in Moscow to be told, as you've just said, Iran wants to believe the public line. The question is there a private line that contradicts? And is Russian relations with Iran on the defense, on the intelligence, on the military side, on the diplomatic side, and White House to Mr. Pezeshkian, Are those lines the same or are they in contradiction? Those are questions. And I have to say, to be honest, Russia is not convincing its allies that it's solidly, militarily, diplomatically aligned in one direction.
Yeah, but I think when you talk with Iranian officials, they may not, mention the private talks between the two governments.
Right.
But it seems to me that even behind the scene, the negotiations that we are not aware of, we don't know what is going on between Iranian officials and Russia, obviously, but we can see the official, policy, the way that they're talking about it. It seems that there is a pretty, you know, robust, and I think they, after all, in the bottom of their heart, they believe that Russia is the partner. They trust Russia because they feel that a threat that is coming to Iran. John, let's put it this way. What is the alternative to Iran? Let's assume Iran, they can bring down the Iran government, the Iranian so called regime. What is the alternative? And how is that going to benefit Russia? Or how is that going to benefit China? Nobody gonna benefit from that sort of change. This is
Yeah, I agree
this
with
is a
you.
logic.
There's no doubt that the way you've put the question, the answer is obvious from the Russian side. However, what we've been saying, what we've started with in referring to the Kirill Dmitriev line, is that there is a powerful and influential view in Moscow around President Putin, that Russia's future is ultimately with the United States and with restoring business as usual. That means acceptance of what President Putin, not me, not anybody else, President Putin told George Bush 25 years ago in the war between Jewish capital and Islamic capital. In that war, Dmitriev is on the side of Jewish capital. By Jewish capital, what President Putin meant 25 years ago is US in combination with Israel. And that's the threat you face, and it's a nuclear threat you face. And from the beginning of the Putin administration to now, there's a reluctance to point out that not only does Iran have the right to peaceful development of nuclear energy, on which Russia is assisting technically, technologically, and materially, but Iran has the right to self defense from nuclear war threats from Israel, which are assisted by, guided by, financed by the United States and the European alliance. So Iran faces nuclear war threat, and the Russian position is that Iran should not ever have the capacity to deter with nuclear weapons what it faces from Israel. And so we have the elaborate and lengthy negotiations to protect Iran, which in which Russia's been engaged, protect Iran and its civil nuclear capacities, while trying to deter the United States and Israel from attacking in conventional terms against Iran. Well, we have a lot of podcasters who wish to believe, wishful thinking, that the US and Israel have been deterred this time round, as they were deterred during the war of last year, by a combination of Iran and Russia and its capabilities. Well, one could look at the evidence and say it's in fact Iran's internal self-defense capabilities which remain deterrent for Israel and the United States. So we'll move on to the next phase. On the one hand, external attack failed. decapitation attack failed last year. This, we've just passed through the phase of internal rioting and fifth column regime change methods. No one in Iran, I guess, expects there'll be any time soon a root causes peace between Trump, Israel, and Iran, do they? So the question you're raising is, how does Russia contribute to Iran's self sufficiency to the point at which it deters attack by threatening counterattack, short of nuclear capacity, which Iran lacks? And what role can Russia play in that if Russia is equally, or that is to say, President Putin is equally supportive of Israel's definition of its security? There's a contradiction here, isn't there? If there's a contradiction, there's a difference of political opinion and resources in Russia. If there's a difference in factional political terms, if there's a difference in intelligence assessment, if there's a difference in ideology, then there's bound to be less confidence that the next time round will be as effective as this one or last year's one. And what role is President Putin personally playing when he has made a record of support for Israel's security as a priority, and in which Kirill Dmitriev represents what President Putin once called the spearhead of Russian alliance with Jewish capital. This isn't a religious matter, not at all. And President Putin made it clear it's not religious, but it is, let's say, one of the lines of force that you can see President Putin saying privately 25 years ago. If he said it privately 25 years ago, the question is, what's he saying privately now? And in an important way, the Russian line on the Assad government in Syria, the subsequent attempts by the Russian side to preserve its bases in agreement with the Jelani regime, the subsequent Russian attitude to the attack on Caracas. We can go on and on and on. What exactly is Russia's military support worth if it retreats in those places? Is that a signal to the offensive line in the United States, the offensive line in Tel Aviv? Is it an encouragement to believe that Russia's eventually going to fold? That, I'm asking that question, but the question's made public every day on the other side. There's endless discussions of the quotes weakness of the Russian side and the vulnerability of President Putin internally, because the same internal fifth column, the same internal regime change forces are being stimulated by the United States and their European allies. And those allies continue to be confident that if they continue to wage these combination of wars, they will succeed. Russia will fold. Russia will collapse. They are confident. Is that an illusion? Well, those who wish to believe that otherwise need to prove it.
John, the reality not is not just about Iran. You see, the whole region somehow is scared. The Arab state are totally scared of, the way that Israel is behaving. They don't see the threat Iran to be the major issue, the major problem of the West Asia, as they were trying for many years to picture Iran as the major problem. Right
Yes.
now, even with this sort of chaos that they're trying to make in Iran, you see the position of the Arab states, the Gulf state, together with Turkey, by the way. Erdogan today said We are with our brothers. We know that Iran and Turkey, when it comes to Gaza, they're not pretty much the same position in the same position. They differ, and they differ, in my opinion, drastically. But when it comes to the situation in the West Asia, Erdogan said that we are supporting our brothers and sisters in Iran against this Israeli backed sedition. And
Hmm.
it seems that the whole region is feeling the threat coming from Israel. It's not just about Iran. I don't know how Russia evaluate all these changes. You mentioned it's not the case of Iran anymore. It's about what's going on. Just remembering what has happened in Syria. The fight between the Kurdish and the ISIS, the
Hmm.
Al-Jolani government. Both of them are somehow supported by the United States. They're fighting each other. They're releasing those head, these people who were part of the Daesh, part of the ISIS, from the prisons. This is a huge chaos happening right now. I cannot believe that Russia can sit aside and say nothing and feeling nothing, no threat out of all these changes that are happening. And considering, all the position coming not just from Arab states together with Turkey.
Well, we agree, but I'm not sure what the question is. Uh,
The question is, when you bring all these, not Iran, not just Iran is, in my opinion, is of particular importance for Russia. And Russia is of particular importance for Iran right now,
yes.
as I know. And how about all these forces coming into the calculations? These are important factors to be considered.
I agree. Uh, what we can say is that uh, there are divisions, fundamental divisions in Moscow about the nature of the threat and fundamental differences on what's the way forward for Russia. We've mentioned that there's a very strong commitment to one war at a time, the belief that it's such a priority for Russia to end the war in the Ukraine now that all other conflicts with the United States, with Israel, all threats against Russia's strategic allies, China, India, Iran, North Korea, should be subordinated to Russia's priority to resolve the war in the Ukraine. Okay, that if there's a consensus in Moscow, and in the present situation, given the questions you've raised, there are such striking differences. It's not fair to say, not correct empirically to say there's a consensus. When you say the when the Russian consensus is we have to resolve the war in the Ukraine, at least achieve short to medium term resolution, that Ukraine as a battlefield will not threaten us as it is now. And that leads to the conclusion that the US is a better opportunity. President Trump is a better opportunity for achieving those terms than the Europeans. So the Russian side exaggerates, unreasonably exaggerates the differences between the Europeans and Trump on terms for resolving the war, because the Russian side wants to believe that Trump is committed to peace with Russia and resumption of mutual security. Well, there's no evidence that that's the case of President Trump's behavior anywhere in the world. And there's no evidence at all that the so called understandings President Putin reached with President Trump in Anchorage, Alaska last August were in fact understandings accepted on the US side. So you have an argument rhetorically, are there any understandings between Putin and Trump of from Alaska? And do they continue to represent an opportunity to reach an agreement with Trump versus the Europeans. The Russian public argument uh, on that shows significant differences, and that argument then leads to the behavior of people like spokesman Peskov, spokesman Zakharova, who don't wish to offend, tell the truth about Trump's behavior in Gaza, Trump's behavior in Venezuela, Trump's behavior at sea. The view is pacify, ingratiate, appease the man, because he's our only opportunity to end the European determination or neutralize the European determination to go on fighting. That, in my judgment, and it's not my, it's a conclusion based on my Russian sources, that's not believed by significant parts of the Russian decision making group, especially the military and the intelligence services. They don't see the evidence that Trump represents an opportunity. Rather, they see the evidence that Trump is a spearhead for long term US strategic ambition for hegemony. Okay? Now, if that's the way you differ on the Ukraine battlefield priority, how can you reach agreement on what's to be done to support Iran, what's to be done to support Cuba, what's to be done to support North Korea, and so on and so forth? For example, what happens then in that doubt that is expressed by Russia's strategic allies is that each of the strategic allies have to fend for themselves, develop self sufficiency, build as best they can on their Russian military supply lines, and make sure that the intelligence sharing and military supply lines continue to work while the Kremlin says whatever it says. We've seen in the last few hours a very unusual summit meeting between Prime Minister Modi of India and the leadership of the UAE. A fly-in, a 2-hour meeting in India is unusual because of its brevity and because of its seniority. What does it signal? That India and the UAE are trying to find directly a method for neutralizing the threat that Saudi Arabia represents with Pakistan as a long-term strategic threat to India. And who is behind both Saudi Arabia and Pakistan? Well, it's the Trump regime, isn't it? Isn't that obvious? Right. Since it's obvious in India, and since it's obvious it can't be discussed openly, since India also has a problem of being punished by the United States for its relationship with Russia, since all of these things are obvious but can't be said so as not to trigger even more aggression from Trump, what do we see as evolving? Indian self sufficiency while preserving the military logistic lifelines with Russia. The same must be said of Iran, and you've just expressed it. The military lifelines that constitute the basis for self sufficiency in defense and in deterrence, they must remain secret. They must remain deterrent for both Trump and the Israelis and the Pakistanis. So, when they're deterrent at that level, what we see is what happened to you. When they're deterrent on the borders where air defense works. Inside the borders, you have increasing attempts at regime change of the kind we've just seen in Iran. We will see more of that in Russia. It's bound to happen. That's what the Americans aim to do. there's no opportunity. It's unrealistic to imagine that President Trump is simply an individual against his own military and intelligence services in changing the US attempt to exercise hegemony. Exercising hegemony when it runs into opposition of air defense or naval defense kind and goes after regime change internally. In Russia, there's a very fertile factional support. It starts with the central bank's policies. It starts with capital export on the part of the oligarch businesses and so on. I don't want to repeat things we've said before. So I'm uh, coming to trying to answer your question by saying the present conditions are, must not be exaggerated to imply either that there's a serious strategic split between Europe and the United States on the threat Iran faces, or the threat Russia faces, or the threat China faces, okay, or the threat India faces. But self sufficiency in deterrence strategy requires maximum secrecy, maximum exaggeration, if you like, of the capacity to ward off threats both internally and externally. And that requires consensus, genuine consensus, democratic consensus. That whatever divisions that are natural within a society, ethnic divisions, religious divisions, ideological ones, class ones, whatever divisions there are cannot be mobilized and will not be mobilized by the United States and its allies to the destruction of the country. Russia's been through that. Uh, we Russia went through that from 91 until 2001, and it was a success. The regime change you just defeated in, let's say, a matter of 2 weeks, Russia took 10 years to defeat. All power to you, right? Now, all Russians know what the costs were of the Yeltsin era defeat imposed by the US administration, starting with the Clinton administration. All Russians understand that, and they don't want to go through it again. And they regard President Putin as a staunch defender of the Russian existential interest there. And that's why President Putin's internal support is so strong and stable. But it's conditional. And I think we've just explained what the conditions are.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you, Nima, and thank you for your analysis of the situation where you're sitting. I hope that we can see that where we're sitting is very uncomfortable for both of us
Yeah.
and for our people. And second, uh, why we have to, let's say, minimize the exaggeration and reduce the wishful thinking, and to understand better how to what the plans are of the adversary side and what they're capable, not because they're foolish, not because they're insane, mad, and so forth, because they're careful, calculating. And this isn't the first year in which they've been planning these attempts to divide and destroy both Iran and Russia. So I'm glad we're talking in these, let's call them constructive, frank terms, as the diplomatic formula works. But it does involve
Yeah.
some unpleasant realities. And when we face unpleasant realities, what do we got? Well, we can go for wishful thinking or we can go for the evidence. And I'm glad that we here on your podcast, Nima, and I'm grateful to you, look at the evidence before we jump into wishful thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. Great pleasure, John, as
Thank you.
always.
See you next week.
See
Bye.
you.